There is a wound in the granite at Aswan that has been photographed by millions of tourists, and somehow, almost none of them ever ask the one question that actually matters. Not how old is this, not who built it. The question is simpler and stranger. What tool leaves a mark like that? Because when you stand next to the unfinished obelisk, still fused to the bedrock it was cut from, and you run your eyes along the trench beside it, you are not looking at chaos. You are looking at rhythm. Scoop after scoop after scoop, evenly spaced, evenly curved, like something with a fixed radius swept through solid stone and simply lifted it away. This year, someone finally pointed an AI system at thousands of close-up images of those marks and asked it to measure what human eyes had been glossing over for a century. What came back did not confirm the story we've been telling ourselves. It complicated it. And the real answer is stranger and more human than the myth that's about to spread across your feed. For most of the last 100 years, the textbook explanation for how the ancient Egyptians shaped granite has gone like this. They had no iron, no steel, no machinery, so they used raw persistence. Balls of dolerite, a stone denser and tougher than granite itself, pounded against the surface again and again until the grain gave way. Slow, brutal, effective. Archaeologists have actually tested this. They've stood in the sun with dolerite hammerstones and beaten on granite slabs for hours, and it works. You can remove real material this way. That experiment has been treated for decades as the closing argument. Case solved, move on. But anyone who has actually done the pounding, and anyone who has actually looked closely at what pounding produces, knows that the surface it leaves is rough, fractured, uneven. Every blow is a small, separate accident, and a wall built from 10,000 separate accidents looks like it. It does not look like the smoothest scoops at Aswan, the ones that ripple across the rock face in near-identical arcs, spaced with a consistency that has nothing accidental about it. That mismatch is real, and it's the part of the story worth taking seriously. So when the high-resolution images were fed into Grok and it was asked, without being told the correct answer in advance, to measure the geometry of the marks and compare them against known cutting methods, the interesting part wasn't that it produced a dramatic verdict. It's that measurement is exactly the kind of task a model like this is suited for, and exhaustive measurement is exactly what 100 years of squinting at photographs never really delivered. It logged widths, depths, spacing, curvature, across thousands of individual scoops, at a scale no single researcher could do by hand in a lifetime. And what it found was tight consistency in size and spacing on the most refined sections of the site. Tolerances a human swinging a hammerstone by hand, fatigued, distracted, working through the 400th blow of the day, should not be able to hold. Here's where the story usually goes off the rails, and where I want to slow down instead of speeding up. A tight, consistent groove does not, by itself, mean an unknown machine. It means a guided tool. And Egyptian stoneworkers had exactly that. By the Old Kingdom, quarry teams were using copper tubular drills, hollow copper pipes rotated by hand or bow drill, fed with wet quartz sand as an abrasive. The sand does the actual cutting. The copper is just the carrier. Because the tube is rigid and its rotation is mechanically guided by a fixed pivot, the groove it cuts is smooth, curved, and remarkably uniform, run after run, in a way that hand-swung percussion never is. Egyptologists have pulled drill cores out of granite blocks that show exactly this. Parallel striations from the rotating abrasive, a clean circular kerf, and a regularity that comes from the geometry of the tool, not the steadiness of the arm behind it. Separately, quarry workers used copper and later bronze saws, again fed with sand slurry, dragged back and forth under tension, sometimes weighted or worked by teams pulling in sequence. That too produces long, smooth, evenly spaced passes because the saw's path is constrained by the cut it's already made. You don't need to invent a lost technology to explain a fixed radius. You need to remember that a drill and a saw are definitionally tools that hold a shape steady so a soft human arm doesn't have to. This is where the AI framing gets honest instead of sensational. When you actually cross-reference Grok's kind of measurement against the experimental archaeology already done on these exact tools, and there's decades of it, going back to Reginald Engelbach's excavation reports on Aswan in the 1920s, and more recent replication work by people like Dennis Stocks, who spent years physically reproducing Egyptian drilling and sawing with period-accurate materials. The impossible precision stops being impossible. Stocks measured drill cores from the Cairo Museum and reproduced their exact striation patterns using nothing but copper tubes, sand, water, and patient rotation. The uniformity isn't evidence of a vanished supercivilization. It's evidence that copper plus abrasive systems, correctly used, are far more capable than cavemen banging rocks makes them sound. The dolerite pounding wasn't wrong as a technique. It really was used, especially for roughing out large masses of stone fast, which is exactly why the unfinished obelisk's outer trenches show coarser, more irregular tool marks than the fine dress surfaces elsewhere. Pounding for bulk removal, then drilling and sawing with abrasive for precision work are two different stages of the same production process, not two different mysteries. What about the marks that seem to run into corners too tight for an arm, or up walls too high to stand at, or underneath blocks that were never moved? Some of these observations are simply true and not mysterious at all once you know the toolkit. Copper saws could be worked from angles a swinging hammer couldn't manage, because a saw doesn't need swing room, it needs tension and a stroke, and two workers pulling a rope tension blade can reach into a slot neither of their bodies could fit into. Drill cores by nature bore into confined spaces. That's the entire point of a drill versus a hammer. And marks under blocks that were never removed is frequently just marks made before the neighboring block was set in place, or marks from an earlier, abandoned quarrying attempt that later work built around. Ancient quarries were reused, extended, and abandoned over centuries. Reading every anomaly as evidence of superhuman reach skips the much simpler explanation that the sequence of construction wasn't what a modern viewer assumes at first glance. Then there's the test pits, the narrow shafts sunk directly into the bedrock, some of them curving instead of running straight down. The pseudo-archaeological reading treats the curves as proof that the ancient quarriers could somehow see mineral veins buried in solid rock. But this backwards. Stoneworkers didn't need to see inside the granite to follow its grain. Granite has visible surface tells, subtle color banding, feldspar streaks, hairline fractures, that an experienced quarryman reads the way a woodworker reads grain in a plank, adjusting the cut by feel and sight as he goes. A pit that curves to avoid a weak seam isn't evidence of hidden ground-penetrating radar. It's evidence of exactly the kind of accumulated, generational craft knowledge you'd expect from people who quarried this same rock face for 1,000 years and passed the trade down from father to son. The claim that gets repeated the most breathlessly is the idea of an inverse skill timeline, that the oldest work at the site is the most refined, and the dynastic-era work, the pieces we can date with confidence because they're covered in hieroglyphs, is cruder. If that pattern is real anywhere in the archaeological record, the far more likely explanation isn't a lost civilization erased from memory. It's that different tasks call for different techniques, and refinement varies by the purpose of the specific stone being cut, not by some steady march of technological progress across centuries. A roughly hewn test trench and a temple obelisk's dressed face were never trying to look the same, because they were never meant to serve the same purpose. Comparing their finish and concluding skill was lost is comparing a foundation to a facade. I want to be straight with you about the AI itself too, because this matters for how you should read any video that opens with an AI discovered. A language model handed a set of images and asked to identify what created a pattern isn't running a physics simulation or consulting some independent ground truth. It's pattern matching against text and imagery it was trained on, including almost certainly decades of both legitimate Egyptology and a very large amount of ancient aliens content that circulates online. Ask a model a leading question with no counter-evidence supplied, and there's a real risk you get back an eloquent-sounding synthesis of whatever was most vivid in its training data, not a verified physical finding. That doesn't mean AI is useless here. Feeding it thousands of images to log measurements at a scale no team of grad students could match by hand is a genuinely useful thing to do, and it's exactly the kind of grunt work these tools are good at. The mistake is treating the AI's narrative output, the confident paragraph explaining what the numbers mean, as equivalent to peer-reviewed material science. The measuring can be trusted more than the storytelling wrapped around it. So, where does that leave the actual mystery? Because there is one, and it's worth sitting with instead of manufacturing a bigger one. The genuine open questions at Aswan are things like exactly how a team moved a stone in the hundreds of tons range without modern lifting equipment, what the full logistics chain looked like from quarry face to river barge to final temple site, and how much of the labor force's technique was standardized training versus individual craft improvisation passed hand to hand. Those are real, unresolved, and actively studied questions, and none of them require inventing a vanished super civilization to be fascinating. The truth is that Bronze Age and Old Kingdom stoneworkers pulled off feats with copper, sand, wood, rope, and human coordination that still make modern engineers stop and do the math twice. That's not a smaller story than ancient aliens. It's a bigger one because it's about what disciplined, patient, deeply skilled human beings can actually do without a single machine in the room. If you want the honest version of the Aswan story, it isn't a cover-up. It's a 5,000-year-old trade secret hiding in plain sight, written not in some lost language, but in the tool marks themselves, and cracked not by a single AI moment, but by a century of quiet, unglamorous fieldwork from people who actually picked up a copper tube and a handful of sand and tried it themselves. The marks aren't evidence of what we've forgotten. They're evidence of what we're only now starting to fully appreciate. So next time someone tells you a machine finally revealed the truth no one was supposed to talk about, ask them the same question I'm asking you. Has anyone actually tried it with a copper drill and a bag of sand? Because someone has. And it worked.